welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Those of you that are joining us live and those watching this later on as a recording, I want to welcome you to our webinar presentation today called So You've Outgrown Your Spreadsheet. It'll be presented by Derek Trider. Derek joined the QRA team about 2 years ago. Since that time, he's actually kind of made his way into the aerospace and defense space primarily. So most of the customers that he's dealing with are the NASAs and the Lockheed Martins of the world. And during that time, Derek has really shown the ability to take a consultative sales approach with every customer that we deal with here at QRA. And so that's allowed him to join, to grow his customer base here and provide a lot of value to our customers. So we're super appreciative of having Derek on the team and thrilled to have him be presenting today on this So You've Outgrown Your Spreadsheet presentation. It is a disgusting day here in Halifax, Canada today. It is rainy and cold and not January-like at all for Canada. So pardon if we're a little bit grumpy under the circumstances. It is really quite miserable outside right now. Big rain and windstorm, and we could be seeing power outages here as well, so bear with us as we move through the process here. So a little bit about the format of today's presentation. I want to set out 3 rules at the beginning, kind of like the genie does when you open the bottle. One, you'll notice Derek in his approach and the way that we talk about the different issues here. As I mentioned, he has a very consultative approach to what we do. I want to just lay out right off the bat, we are not consultants when it comes to selecting a requirements management tool, which is the topic of interest here today. Rule number 1 is don't look to us to be the consultant that tells you which one to pick. Secondly, we also can't tell you which one is the best. We do support multiple requirement management tools with our software, including Doors Next, Gem, and Polarian, as well as Word and Excel, which we're going to be showing here today. But we can't come into your organization, especially on a call like this, but even in a one-to-one consultation and say, hey, I think this is going to be the best one for you. So don't look for that kind of service from us for us to pick a champion and say this is the best tool. They each have pros and cons, different capabilities, and will be ideal for different customers. So where we are coming from today is from the perspective of a lot of our customers are going through this challenge. So they come to us looking for help with improving the quality of their requirements. And through those discussions, it turns out they're in Word documents, they're in Excel spreadsheets, and are wondering when it's the right time to do that. So that's where the topic of this conversation came from. Derek, through a lot of the conversations that he's had with customers, has had similar conversations one-on-one. We thought this might be a topic of interest for a lot of our prospects and customers, friends of the company and visitors of the website, that this could be a topic of interest. So that's what we'll be presenting on today. And the third point of the genie rules of what you can't ask for us is to build a requirement management tool. We are not going in that direction, although there are needs and opportunities there. The market is well saturated with a lot of really great options for your requirement management selection. So don't look for us to be doing that part of it for you. But that said, if there are any questions as we're going through the process here today, the chat and the Q&A section is available. We'll be just addressing those questions as they come in throughout the presentation. We'll also have time at the end to be talking a little bit more detail about those and addressing some of the questions that come in. So if there is anything that you want to ask, even if you break one of the rules, feel free to go ahead and ask, and we'll address the questions that we can and that are well suited for this format. But certainly if you'd like to have a follow-up discussion with Derek, myself, or another member of the team, we'd be very happy to connect with you afterwards. So thank you for taking the time today. I will turn things over to Derek, and this is So You've Outgrown Your Spreadsheet. Derek?
Thanks, James. I really appreciate the introduction. So you've outgrown your spreadsheets. It's a question we get a little bit on, am I ready? But what happens is we speak to people at some point throughout the requirement development process and maturity, where they're finding they're having subtle issues, and they're trying to figure out the next step is a requirement management tool, a requirement quality tool, or if there's just simple changes they can make to their process to kind of improve some of the problems that they're experiencing. So that's where this kind of the situation comes from. And I hope it's relevant to your experience. So just on the agenda today is a quick introduction of the problem, how we come about to interact with the problem. We'll do a quick overview of Word and Excel and how that interacts with the requirement management and development lifecycle. Introducing new tools and the things you should consider when you're going down that route. Common requirement problems, the process and the quality issues associated with them. requirement management and quality tools, things to consider, maybe some that could be on your radar, and some of the drawbacks and roadblocks that you're going to experience when you take those next steps, if you take those next steps. So as an introduction, we speak to people, all the way from the biggest companies, in the aerospace and defense, medical device, infrastructure, nuclear, on occasion, automotive, and so on and so forth, requirement heavy organizations and processes. And we also speak to folks who are, coming into their first projects, they're coming into requirements management systems that are beginning to mature, and they're trying to figure out what the next steps are. So we have a lot of experience speaking with folks on the early end of the spectrum. And so much so we decided to put together a brief webinar for it. So what's there to like about Word and Excel? For a lot of these folks, they're working within Word and Excel, and they have things they really like about them. And there are some things to their credit that make it easy. So it's easy to use. So everyone typically already knows how to use Word and Excel. They don't have to do a special training regimen or onboarding or customer success effort to train people on how to use this. They've probably been working from smaller teams where it was the only available option, and they're ready to kind of take the next step or see if there's something else there. It's also easy to access. Everyone already has it. It's not seen as an extra expense because it's already a part of the system at some point or another. It's cheap, or at least it seems cheap. Again, people already have it. It's baked into the cost, but I will put in brackets that it seems cheap. There could be other expenses as part of your process as a result of choosing Word or Excel for your requirements management purposes. It's familiar, so people already know it. So obviously, people are averse to new things they have to learn, and that's with good reason. There are learning curves to a lot of the other options out there. But for that reason alone, a lot of people like to stick with Word and Excel, even past the point where it's appropriate. And we hear a lot, it's good for teams our size, and that might be the case. But you want to be ready for those changes before it's not good for a team of your size. It only takes one really catastrophic incident for you to quickly realize the value of making the next step. And you certainly want to be ahead of that curve as it comes down your way. One thing we hear a lot is that our customers use Word and Excel. So this is actually a fairly good reason to consider, having a process with Word and Excel intertwined with it. You want to have something, concrete, replicable as what to do when words or requirements come from you in a Word and Excel document. We can get into some of the ways that can be dealt with, but it's something we hear a lot. And having a process, whether it's a requirements management tool or a way to integrate those into Word or into Excel, that's firmly identified and complied with, is important. And certainly you can import and export from Excel. So they can say, okay, we're going to give our other customers requirements that are already in Excel. They can put them into the requirements management tool that way. It might save a step. It might be short-term thinking, but there's some advantages there at the beginning. And it's flexible. So it's also a downside to Excel, but it's flexible. It's not built for requirements management. Neither Word nor Excel is built to house your requirements. So you can do a lot with it that other requirement management tools might not be able to do. But typically the requirement management tools are going to have reasons for the rigidity, and the options that you need to buff out your process are already there. So with that said, we're going to get through the drawbacks of Word and Excel on their own. Please don't be discouraged by the one or the two there. There are 2 slides on the drawbacks, but I'll be quick. So there's multiple versions. You can think that if in a perfect world, everyone's working on the same iteration. So that's a big thing that requirement management tools bring into the process fairly obviously. So you can imagine if you're someone who hasn't worked with a requirements management tool and you're still using Word or Excel, it's possible for different people in the team to be using different versions of the same project and making changes at different times. So it's a very obvious way that, when brought to light, that you can see that the value of having one source of truth for the project within the tool. It's a little clunky. So they weren't built for requirements. For the same reason they're flexible, they're not built for requirements. And it's implicit when you're using it that they weren't built for requirements. So you can buff out major spreadsheets to give you some of the features that requirements management tools have, but it's certainly not the best way. And certainly if you have to go back from requirements management tool towards a Excel or hopefully not a Word document, you're going to see how clunky that truly is. And there's limited tooling integrations. So as your systems engineering framework improves or you work to teams that have more complex processes, you're going to see there's lots of integration between different tooling. And Word and Excel while it can be exported and imported into other versions, it just doesn't scale as well when you're getting into the weeds of really big projects. So certainly something to consider. Again, we'll touch on the tooling integration here shortly. And poor formatting. So Word especially has very poor ways to format the requirements in ways that they're easy to parse, especially if you're sorting for certain requirements under a certain component set or what have you. It's really limiting in your ability to actually go through there and format it to your advantage. A big one is the traceability. So a lot of the folks, when they're coming from smaller teams or the teams that are actually utilizing Word or Excel, they're thinking a lot less about traceability. And the teams that are doing this a little bit further down the maturity curve or having a little bit more experience, traceability is a very major thing for them. So the ability to trace requirements to the higher level requirements that help shape them, or the parent requirements that they're a part of, or the changes that have been made to those requirements, it becomes pretty critical to the system. So as you grow and your projects get more complex, that's something you're really going to want to lean on. It's tough to apply the baseline. So you're going to have baselines of certain requirements, especially if you're making components or projects for components of other systems, where you want to have baselines set somewhere and put away. So again, if you're going to have this kind of ties back to not having one standard version of the requirements, but if you have a baseline set of requirements that the team can always pull from, it's a repository built away in a requirements management tool, preferably, it makes it a lot easier to use practically. And there's limited collaboration. So you can consider that as the team grows, you have experts in different fields, certain people responsible for different things. You want to have a tool that allows them to collaborate effectively, as opposed to everyone having this siloed off into their own spreadsheet. And it's overall way more difficult to manage the process. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as well. Slide 2 of the drawbacks of the Word and Excel on their own. So it lacks consistency. So you want to have the same people working on certain portions of the project. The consistency control that kind of heads into the management of the process, certainly something to consider as you're making that change. The limited reuse of requirements. So there's certain requirements within a set, within a component that should be reused or could be reused throughout the process. But we want to make sure we're using the most up-to-date, most practical versions of those requirements. And so obviously a repository of those baked into the requirements management tool makes that a little easier. A big one is the control on who can make the changes. So on top of, in Word and Excel, you could potentially have multiple versions of the same document. You can say, okay, user 1's going to make these changes, and user 2 is going to make these changes. But if you can actually have that control over the actual system, you don't have to be as worried about that risk being brought into the process. And you can obviously track who's making those changes, or just set permission levels on who can have those requirements, access to those requirements, sorry. And the changes aren't tracked. You don't know who's changed what. It becomes really pivotal to know where these changes occurred, especially when you're backtracking through hopefully the problems don't occur, but if they do occur, it's important to have that accessibility. So here's the requirement maturity curve, which I briefly spoke about. I think you'll hear people mention this. Quick preface, this isn't backed up by data at this point. This is something that we've noticed in the last decade or so of working with requirements teams. And recently it's been backed up by a couple teams who did internal audits of their engineers. So hundreds of requirements interfacing engineers who gave their opinion and their experience on certain questions, and actually borrow what we had been hearing for some amount of time. And that's that at the beginning of someone's experience with requirements, they kind of think they're good. So requirements aren't that easy. The system shall do this. Look at me, I can do it. But in actuality, it takes a really big screw up at the requirements level, a lot of project rework, and a lot of humbling to realize how little you know. So even the best requirement engineers in the world will say, they walk into these situations with far more trepidation than the folks who are just beginning. So there's a little bit of a curve here where as you get more experienced, you get humbled, and then you actually start to build on what you didn't know. So you can only start to really buff out those parts of your understanding when you realize how little you know, and then moving on from there. So should you consider new tools? Well, first you have to assess your situation. Remember that tools are only as good as the people actually using them, and every situation is a little different. So it's hard for us to tell you that you should. However, there are a lot of key indicators and a lot of signs that maybe it's a good time for you to consider new tools. So when to consider new tools? there are a couple situations where it becomes a little bit more obvious that your current tool set isn't going to cut it. So you're planning on you're planning for a brand new design phase. If this is a big lift, if this is far more than you've taken on before, certainly leaning on tooling to augment your process is going to be helpful, presuming that it's an easier lift to get that into your system than it is to do it without it. Your team is experiencing growth and hiring more people to compensate. So if your team's growing and the plan is to grow into the future and you see growth coming, certainly getting ahead of that curve is the way to go about that. Doing it when there's already those people there, they're already looking for ways to become effective and contribute to the team. Is this too late? You certainly want to have something into your system and scale it as the team grows. It's really tough to implement something after more people are already there. So getting that sort of process decision down early is certainly helpful. Your organization is starting to build complex projects and products. So I think everyone here is probably aware, but the complexity of our projects is growing. So you'll see really complex software systems within other products, some products being integrated with more complex projects. The point being that the projects over time are getting far more complex, and so too are the requirements. So if you're going to have to, if you foresee yourself building complex projects, you're going to need slightly more advanced tooling, or should use slightly more advanced tooling to put on there. James, any comments on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in like that point in particular, building more complex projects and products. A lot of our customers that are working in Word specifically, you kind of alluded to that earlier, Derek, have attributes that they have starting to track on the requirements. So you might have specifications about certain parts that you're using, or people that are responsible, or what state a requirement is in terms of its approval, or rationale statements to go along with it and things like that. If you're working with that within a Word document, it's basically everything's flat. You can search for specific words if you want to, and you might have them organized in tables, but that information isn't in a database where it can be referenced. So between Word and Excel, Excel is better for that because at least you can have them in different fields and be able to filter through them. But certainly a requirement management tool, that's one of the areas where those shine, is they actually have defined set areas in that tool to track different information, and they'll work with you, of course, to set that up the way that works best for your team for tracking the proper attributes and what's actually worth putting into that. So that complexity, of course, increases with any projects that have embedded software. If you're dealing with any product that has physical and a smart component to it, that there's information being processed and software that's making decisions around how the hardware will act. That sort of complexity requires an increase in the rigidity or the formality of the way that you present that information, instead of just writing everything out and say, okay, yeah, I can go ahead and do that. So that's one area I think of all these. This would be, in my opinion, one of the biggest indicators. So I just want to throw that in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's certainly on the requirement management tool front. That's completely true. I think we get into here. You're being asked to produce more output with less people. This kind of ties into what James had mentioned, and another tool set that we'll be introducing here. If you're being asked to produce more with less people, certainly there's a labor crunch at the moment, and people are trying to figure out ways to do more with less. Having tools to optimize this, having tools to improve your efficiencies, or take out some of the manual labor, is certainly something to take a look at this point. You're being asked to integrate with a broader systems engineering framework. So as part of a maturing systems engineering framework, you're certainly going to need access to requirements management tools. There's just many things at that level and validation that are going to be much easier to do without. Certainly people were doing it before, but that's certainly not an adventure you need to do unnecessarily.
And that last one, Derek, actually prompted our first question here. So I think this is a good time to ask it. And if we're getting to it later, you can just mention that as well. But we kind of mentioned the drawbacks of moving away from Word and Excel. Somebody asked, what has been your experience, in your experience, has been the main hesitation when it comes to organizations moving away from Word and Excel? So we've talked about sort of the cons of staying with it. What are some of the challenges of actually making that transition?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we'll definitely get into a little bit more detail on this front. But the two big ones that stand out with me is you'll have legacy members of this team that simply don't want to make the change. So you can picture a worst case scenario if I, as a project manager, and I invest a lot of money into a new management tool that's supposed to take us to that next level, but it's actually more work to onboard and convince people to use. The secondary one is that you have to make sure that it's worth it. So in terms of getting people to use it, that's one thing, but the onboarding curve and the learning curve of getting people up to speed in order to use it, for example, for a project that you want to speed up with this requirement management tool, potentially, it might not be the right time for that. So um,
Yeah,
certainly those two ones stand out to me.
I think even with working with documents as well, Excel can sort of become the mediator. Where if you're working with something within a document, you can have a lot of like references to the headings or like bulleted lists where it's like so and so shall, and then all the things are listed underneath that. That format is fine in a document because you can always just scroll up and see who is responsible. And sometimes it's a little bit disjointed. It's actually harder to work with a document that way than if each one is itemized. But moving to an Excel sheet sort of allows you to get a taste of what it would look like in a management tool, because each cell represents, okay, what information am I putting here? This is the requirement text. This is the rationale statement. This is the ID, things like that. So it allows you to sort of get it organized before making that jump. And yeah, having those singular what we refer to as atomic requirements. So each thing is fully contained within the statement itself is really important when you're going into a management tool, because once you're in that environment, the requirement can be reused in different places and different things are tracing back to it. So it's really important to have all the information contained in the requirement itself. So if the documents are still completely, in Word and have a lot of cross references and relying on headings and things like that, you can start moving towards individual requirements first. And then once you're in a place where everybody kind of is on board with that, it'll make that transition into an actual proper management tool a lot easier. Also, the importing process of getting your existing documents into it is certainly much easier with a sheet. So yeah, great question. And if there's any others, feel free to keep them coming in the chat there as we go on. I'll turn it back to you, Derek.
Thanks a lot, James. Another one to consider here is your last project resulted in significant delays or project rework. So I've alluded to this a little bit at this point. You'll notice a lot of people, not just in our industry, but in other industries, act reactively. So we certainly, it's the best case scenario, we make the change right before some big project delay was likely to occur. But that's never the way it is. We can't time the market like that. What we want to do is, safeguard ourselves against these risks. So we're looking for tools and processes that ensure that these risks don't slip in later into the process. So if you've already experienced a project that had significant delays or project rework, that might be too late by our standards to implement a tool, but certainly before that. And again, you might just say, when you make that distinction, our recommendation would likely be, as soon as possible, or as those projects become more complex and more people grow to them. But certainly you don't want to be the person that figures that lesson out too late. And you're competing against organizations that use modern tooling. So this is a pretty obvious one. So there are lots of teams using requirement quality tools and requirement management tools really effectively. So if you're going to enter a market or continue to compete in a market, you have to be able to mature with the market. So certainly all the industries that I've had the pleasure of working with are pretty mature. There are some that just take a long time, or they're using really old management tools to kind of get this done. But as you start to mature as a company and your goals start to grow, you're certainly going to need to introduce requirement management tools or requirement quality tools if your plan is to scale. And you might need to bring a product or project faster or to market faster than expected. So again, I will put an asterisk here. There is a learning curve to a lot of these tools, especially the requirement management tools. So it might be something to think about if you have a quicker deadline and you need to manage those requirements a little bit more stringently. Again, learning that can be difficult, but there are quality tools that can, of course, speed up review and the authoring process of those requirements. And better quality output. So you could simply have products that aren't meeting the needs that you'd like, or the last project wasn't as strong as you'd like. So simply put, better quality output is likely to occur when using requirement management tools or requirement quality tools, sorry. So what are some popular requirement management tools? For a lot of people, they've never heard of other requirement management tools. You could be someone who's lived in your requirement management ecosystem and thought Word and Excel was the only way to do this. Some of the ones you hear a lot these days are Jamma Connect, Doors Next, Polarian, Codebeamer, Doors Classic, Helix ALM, Jira, Azure DevOps, and PTC Windchill and Integrity. There are more. They're typically, excuse me, they're typically geared towards different areas of development, and industries tend to lead towards different ones. It really depends on your process and where you are and how many people you have, and the products that you're trying to develop on which one you'd lean towards ultimately. So what are some of the benefits of requirement management tools? Can we get into some of the reasons why you'd want to spend some time here? So increased productivity. So implementing a requirement management tool helps eliminate time-consuming tasks such as copying data across different systems, double checking for inaccuracies, the searching for missing data. Another advantage of requirement management tools is that anyone working on a product development or operations is less likely to encounter process errors, so resulting in less rework caused by outdated data. Decrease costs. So obviously, as you begin to make your product more efficient and find places where there's errors, you can actually change those processes up as you go, and certainly helping to reduce some of those costs. Enhance quality and speed. I think this is fairly intuitive. As you start to learn how to use requirement management tools better, you can work those projects through your processes a little bit more effectively. And projects have a single source of truth. So it's a really effective one. There's a couple different ways in which a single source of truth can improve a team. But as opposed to having multiple documents floating around and not knowing where you are on which one or who's responsible for which, you can really solidify that all within a requirements management tool. So if someone's saying, requirements 200 to 800 are Derek's responsibility, and then I have to flag all the ones that are outside of my subject matter, my level of expertise. It's a really handy way to actually make those changes and track those changes in real time. James, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we see here and like our anecdotal evidence from our customers that have made that transition, and we've worked through that process with some of them of what it takes to get into a requirement management tool. There is also a lot of industry data that backs this up. Specifically, Project Management Institute did a report in 2014 called the Pulse of the Profession on Requirements Management. It's one of these regular publications that they have. They did this one specifically on requirements management. And in terms of the actual data that came out of that, there were some really interesting stats, and it had to do with both the quality of the requirements and also the way that they were managed. And one section of the report actually splits the companies into high performing, medium performing and low performing organizations. And high performing organizations had the trends, of course, of, looking at what tooling was available, of investing in those resources and investing in training, and that's sort of what they considered to be high performing. And they were actually able to notice a statistical difference as they traced project errors as they came out back to how they originally, at what stage they came about, and what was the primary reason for that error, misunderstanding, complication, delay in a project. And one of the interesting stats I found from that one was that for low performing organizations, 10% of their total project cost overruns were caused by poor requirements. But for high performing organizations who invested in this and had tooling and had training and invested in doing requirements management right, they were able to get that number down to 1% on average. And this was cross industry, multiple different companies involved in the study. And 1% of the project cost increases were due to poor requirements for the high performing organizations who invested in this area. And then up to 10% were on the poor performing. And some of the other interesting statistics came out of that as well, like, up to 50% of overall project cost increases, so separate from the actual defects themselves, but 50% of project cost increases could be traced back to issues that were primarily caused by requirements. So there are a lot of anecdotal evidence that we've collected from just talking to our customers and sort of hearing their stories as we've gone through this process. But also there are research and studies that have been done as well that have pointed us in the same direction and given the same idea. So then you see big organizations that, even though it is a lot of work to invest in making a change like this, having the foresight to be able to see, hey, when we get to that future state of where we want to get to, it's going to be worth it because we'll have these increased capabilities going forward. But that process of slowly turning that big ship that's been running the same way for 100 years can take some time. So definitely plan on that taking some time if you do, embark on one of these journeys from an organization that's kind of has a way of doing things the old way. So I think that's relevant to the projects having a single source of truth. But yeah, you can check that study out again. It's the Pulse of the Profession report on requirements management. It's available free online. It's 2014 edition that had those stats in it. Check them out.
Appreciate that insight, James. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it kind of leans into actually the next one where the changes are tracked. So you can imagine, like, even accidentally, someone can make changes to a document. Certainly, I've been guilty of it. Don't tell my supervisor, where you accidentally remove information or change information, just not thinking clearly when you're making those changes. But when that happens within a requirements management tool, it's obviously a safeguard around this, as they're all tracked. Certainly permissions for each user is just something to think about. So not only are they tracked, but you can fully safeguard around clumsy folks like myself, where it's only certain managers that have the ability to approve requirements or validate them or pass them on to the next level. So the varying permissions at each level certainly scale the safeguard against risk and the project quality as you scale. Another handy piece of the baselines are kept consistent and ready. So you're going to have some sort of repository of information that's outside our project, but still within the requirements management tool that is handy and ready to use and always up to date. And then lastly, you can format the tool specifically for requirements-based projects. So it's hard to explain to someone who's only using Word and Excel, but the amount of ways a lot of these tools can be customized specifically to your requirements and what you like to include those requirements and toggling those various attributes is really, really helpful as you scale, obviously. It encourages collaboration. So lastly, when we're paying people like systems engineers to work together, we really want to lean on the most successful and the most knowledgeable in every area. And one spot where that can all happen is much easier than submitting multiple versions of a Word document and having someone clean those up as they go. And lastly, we want to talk about what a requirement quality tool is. So for those of you not familiar with requirement quality tools, they use to improve the language of the requirements at the requirement level. So, at the text level. So the actual language used in the requirements has a big impact on those requirements as they move through their process. And there's many situations where changes are inevitable, but we can reduce the amount of changes and our certainty within the requirements just by getting it right, or by constraining the language used a little bit. So what are some of the benefits of a requirement quality tool? You have an objective source of truth. So there's many times in a document, very much like a requirements management tool, where we want to have everything done in one place so we don't have varying versions of it. We want to do the same thing with our language. So if everyone can agree on a certain language to use, hopefully the tool we choose is customizable and can enforce our team's best practices across the team. Leaving an objective source of truth for the words that can be, or phrases that can be used within those documents. And we want to improve the team's understanding of what a good requirement consists of. So especially at the teams that are still developing and getting their feet wet in the requirements world, they might not fully understand what a good requirement consists of, or they're writing pretty basic requirements. As these requirements get more complex, as our understanding of the industry gets more complex and how we want to use them later, we have to have a really good understanding of what a higher level requirement typically consists of, how it's different from like the user stories that are leading to them, or the inputs from our subject matter experts, or how those lower level requirements are actually going to interact with the system later and what they're intended to achieve. Using a requirement quality tool certainly ups the ability for people to learn that as they go, and that skill set and that improved knowledge scales really well as teams grow. We can improve the requirement consistency and quality. I think that's certainly implicit that after we start improving the language and gently constraining the ways teams can write requirements, there's going to be improved requirement consistency and quality throughout. Speed of the writing and the review. So this one's one to take with an asterisk. You want to be really careful about speeding up the speed of someone's author or someone's ability to write a requirement. So many times you'll hear, okay, we have to press the team. We need these requirements written really quickly. Well, maybe not the place to put the pedal to the metal there. We really want those requirements to be right. Like this is the first place within the project where the products or projects start to take shape. So those requirements being right the first time will save us a lot of time and energy down the road. So especially if you're in a situation where you need requirements developed quicker, automating some of those best practices and automating the review is certainly a good place to look. And if you're a team that has, a normal project delivery, you still want to have the ability to identify project risk factors at the early stages. So obviously, in market far down the process, it's going to cost us a lot of money. Hopefully not a lawsuit. But when they're in design or verification, these places are really, really expensive parts of the process to rework the requirements. So if we can shift our risk tolerance all the way down to the requirements level when they're being delivered and created via natural language, we have a really good handle on what sort of risk factors we're introducing. And if we can constrain those properly within our team, it's going to allow us to have a lot more confidence within our projects from the get-go. We're going to reduce project rework. So when you reduce those risk factors, you're reducing project rework all the way through the process. Again, there's some of the most expensive people within our organization going down rabbit holes of projects or components of projects that actually don't come to fruition because there's a problem with the way the requirements are written. So whether we're accepting requirements from customers or writing those ourselves, actually digging into the quality of the requirements is vital to the value that we output. And simply improving the quality of your projects and your products. Lastly, this is one that goes overlooked very often, but empowering the team and improving morale. So there's a lot of friction between teams as they try to figure out who knows the most about a certain situation. Just a standard of truth, this is the right way, this is the way we're going to do it, an objective source of truth, an objective standard to conform to is really handy as those teams start to figure out how to interact with one another. And so this is where our tool comes in the mix. This will be won't be an overly generous plug. It'll be a quick plug. But for those of you that don't know, QB Scribe is the team that helps teams produce clear requirements in less time. So we're in that requirements quality section. It scores individual requirements for clarity and improves overall consistency throughout the document. And it runs within Microsoft Word or Excel, which is why we interface a lot with folks who are currently using Microsoft Word and Excel. But it also plugs into popular requirements management tools, which we'll get in here. We'll get into early. In a little bit. So how is this done? I'm not going to get too deep into the tool, but there's three main core analysis the tool is running, which is the quality analysis, the consistency report, and the similarity check. So the quality analysis is going to look at requirements that could be misunderstood by a reader and requirements that are too vague to be proven. The consistency report is going to be looking for multiple names for the same object or different systems of units being used. And lastly, when those requirements we're happy with how they are individually, we're going to take a look at those requirements against one another. So are the requirements that are duplicating the same information or having similar or contradicting information between them, and then potentially ambiguous language found within a couple of them that may be intended to do the same thing. It's important to note that we're not taking humans out of this equation. This is still something that's very human focused, but there's things that are just obviously done better by technology. So currently humans are still needed to understand the project, author the framework, and solve the problems that come up on a day-to-day basis. But there's things that are obviously given, we can offload to the computers and more specifically QB Scribe in the situation. Just applying the principles, clarifying the content, and identifying the problems that come up. Certainly at the review section, I think we can all sympathize that would be something we'd like to automate. So there's a couple of really cool features about QB Scribe and where we come into this process. One is that I noted that it works with Microsoft and Excel. So there aren't many integration or tools that kind of work themselves handily into Word and Excel. We actually integrate directly within Word and Excel, and the rule lists and the configurations that make that the formulate or that constrain the requirements that are produced are actually the same or can be used the same across Word and Excel and the requirements management tool that you move into. So we integrate directly with Polarian, Doors, Next, and JAMA. And if you were in a situation where you're moving from Word and Excel into Polarian or Doors or JAMA, and you're worried about the quality of the requirements as you shift, the requirement quality configurations from Word and Excel that you curate and customize to your team's liking are actually the same throughout. So people work in some projects, some legacy projects in Word and Excel, and some in Polarian, and you're still going to have that same level of confidence that the requirements that you knew were strong in Word and Excel are actually just as strong when you first implement them into your requirements management tool, because certainly it's a huge headache when you think that you're going into this requirements management space. It's going to be even easier, but it doesn't actually change anything if your requirements themselves are not strong to begin with. So I'll do a quick walkthrough of the various versions. So we have the quality analysis here in Microsoft Word. That's the QBScribe integration there. That's a quality analysis from QBScribe with Microsoft Excel. It integrates directly with Polarian. You can see the various toggling buttons to get access to the tools view there. There's a full list of all the requirements here and the quality that they have individually and as a set. And you can moderate the requirements at an individual level. You'll quickly see the quality score issues down the side here. This is QBScribe for JAMA. You'll notice the plugin looks very similar. It's a very similar user face between the three. There's just the overall view. It's kind of a bird's eye view of some high quality requirements and some very low risk requirements and some high risk requirements. We can take a look at the term consistency here within JAMA. Again, all these features are available across all three integrations. We take a look at the similarity analysis here within JAMA, where we're taking a look at the requirements, see how similar they are to one another. The QBScribe for Doors Next, again, looks very similar. Here's a similarity analysis within Doors Next. And then it's worth taking a look at the drawbacks and roadblocks that you're going to potentially bring on board. So as you make changes, as you select requirements management tools or requirements quality tools, there's certain things to take a look at. I would say at the evaluation level is probably the place to have those conversations, but certainly lots of people have them after they've made the decision to move forward with a requirement management tool or requirement quality tool. So it's going to be the case that employees find it hard to transition away from what you're doing. The status quo is a really difficult thing to change. It's that way in a lot of industries. And especially when you're coming from folks who have lived their whole life or had success in requirements in Word and Excel, it's going to be really tough for them to put it down and get on with the next set of tools. The biggest part of this is the legacy employees. So I think we can all think of that one person we work with that's been working in them for a long time. And the last thing we want to do is ask them to switch. Certainly when they made a career of working with one workflow. Picking the right and wrong tool. So there's going to be things that factor into the right and wrong tool. So do you need a requirements management tool? Do you need a requirements quality tool? Are you mature enough to have a requirements quality tool? Is the tool you picked appropriate for your industry or the products you're building? There's going to be a lot of different decisions to be made here. It's not one to be taken lightly, but certainly figure out what your problem is and which tools are best suited to improve them as you grow. It's worth noting that requirements management tools are fantastic. They add a lot to the process, but make sure that they're actually being implemented to solve the problems you're experiencing. They're not going to fix poor requirements. So if your requirements are still struggling, and that's where you're seeing the biggest time kill or time suck, so you're rewriting report requirements, reviews are taking too long, you're experiencing risk throughout the project, and it's because of the way the requirements were written. Those problems aren't going to solve themselves. If you need to train the actual people putting together your documents and working on those projects, a requirement quality tool might be the way to go for you. Training, adoption, and the ease of use. So you want to make sure that the tool you use is easy to train. The adoption makes sense, and it's easy to use. So you want to make sure that the solution that you're bringing into your environment is actually easier than is less work than solving the problem another way. And a customization to your needs. So if you're working with a tool, you might be under the impression, or you might be hoping that it can customize to your needs. Tools in this space really come down to how you can use them and their usability. So if the tool doesn't expressly customize to your needs, or it's a one thing fits all, that's very rarely the situation you want to go with. You want to find something that's catering to your organization or your team's needs specifically, and then using that appropriately onwards. James, something to add?
Yeah, we actually did have another question come in, and we are nearing the end. So if there's any other questions, get them in there now, and we'll touch on them before we get to the end. But someone asked, most of the differences you mentioned seem to compare a management tool with like using Microsoft Word or documents, I guess. What's the biggest difference between trying to use Excel sheets versus a management tool? I guess that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. So yeah, what would be the the jump from Excel to a management tool? What would you say were the biggest differences there, Derek?
Yeah, so some of those there's some of those differences are the exact same and some are a little different. The big ones that are still going to be different are, the traceability of those documents. You want to have one single source of truth, which are that the team can work from and pull from, which is really handy within the requirements management tool space. But it's also worth noting that, and maybe this is what this user, the person who asked this question, is asking, you can have, attempted versions of traceability within traceability matrices within Excel. It's a lot of effort to actually put that in there. It doesn't kind of get you the same sort of results. I think this is a good example when you're trying really hard to do something where there's an easier solution. This is one where it's very obvious that there's something actually pre-built to handle the traceability and the configuration settings within there. So if it's just one or two people and you guys are in constant communication all the time, you might be able to format Excel to handle those, and you can handle those conversations in real time and keep track of who's supposed to make what changes at what point and when it's appropriate. But as soon as that team gets any bigger than that, and you're still trying to do a real push towards traceability and augmenting those changes and taking advantage of those efficiencies that the tools have, I think it's time to have a serious look. So the single source of truth, traceability, and permissions would greatly differentiate it. Anything else to add there, James?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think I answered that the exact same way. So great question. If there's any others, keep them coming here. And yeah, back to you, Derek.
Yeah, for sure. And so this one here is kind of the big overarching problem or thing to think about. So this is actually something I'd attribute back to our CEO, Jordan. He speaks a lot about this, and you also find something similar to this in the INCOSE guidelines. Is the solution easier than the problem? So is what you're building actually going to be used? It doesn't matter if we have the best solution of all time ready to go. We could even make it we can make it free. If it's too hard to actually use and it doesn't actually implement the way we want it to, it doesn't matter how good of an implementation or solution that is. What we need to find is user-friendly tools to adapt to our common problems. So you'll see a shift. Sorry, not a shift. You'll see a difference. Some of the requirements management tools are really, really difficult to use. And you certainly see a shift from, say, the Doors Classic, one of the original requirements management tools that some people love and some people hate. But certainly it's a little different than some of the new modern requirements management tools. And you want to make sure there's certainly a shift in it being a little bit more user-friendly, that if it's not user-friendly and it can't be quickly brought up to quickly adapted to, it's not going to solve the problem that you're hoping it will. So a huge shift towards making sure the solution is reasonable. You can actually expect your team to onboard with it. And there's the training solutions, customer success and customer deployment teams in place to help you with that transition. And last thing is that the tool integrate with the other tools in your process. So you'll notice that our tool in particular, from our experience, Word and Excel is where we started. And then we quickly realized that teams were maturing much like we were. They're going to Polarian, Doors next, and JAMA. And we wanted to be there with them when this happened. And much like the teams that are trying to mature, you want to make sure the tools that you're taking on board will integrate with the next tools likely to be used by your team. So just having a product roadmap or a process roadmap of the things you'd like to achieve and what you're likely to experience will really help you make that decision correct the first time. With that concludes my presentation on outgrowing your spreadsheet. Thanks so much for joining. And I'll hand it back over to James in case there's any other questions lingering there or final thoughts.
All right. Thank you so much, Derek. No questions, no other questions here right now. I will take a moment just to talk about our next webinar. We do have one coming up in February. So let me just jump to my screen share here for a moment and we'll show you how to find that information so you can stay up to date on the latest with us. So right from our homepage, if you head to resources, there's the virtual events tab right there. So if you navigate to virtual events, you will see our upcoming events. The next one is Every Project is a System. I'll be joined by another account executive of ours on the team, Kyle Vino, who's working primarily in the oil and gas space. And so in oil and energy, there's a big mixture. You're not developing products per se, for a lot of these large products. Of course, people are developing products for oil and gas, but when we're talking about EPC contracts, things like that, of actually managing complex projects as opposed to developing complex devices, a lot of these lines get blurred. And so the topic of this one is going to be that every project is a system, and it's about applying systems thinking to standards, contracts, and RFPs. So if you're in an environment where maybe everything is in documents, you're sharing Word documents with teams, that those have your standards or PDFs, things like that. We'll talk about how applying some of those principles from basically product development, systems engineering thinking, making sure that every component or every person that's in that process has a defined role and there's a defined output, how that can be applied to things like standards, contracts, and RFPs. And that's basically taking the best practices from requirement writing, all the things that make a requirement good for developing a project, and how those translate really nicely, both in the way that you structure the requirements, to the way that you define who's responsible, to the language that you use. Those all translate, in our experience, really nicely into projects like standards for internal company standards or industry standards, as well as contracts and requests for proposals that your team would be putting together. So if you head to qricorp.com and click on the virtual events tab under resources, you'll be able to get to that page, and there's a place to register there as well. So we invite you out to that one. I don't see any other comments or questions here, but feel free to get in touch with us. There's tons of links on the website where you can book a call or book a demo with us to see more. And I want to thank you again for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.